Welcome back to Between the Edits. My name is Grace, and today I have the joy of speaking with Samantha Stephenson. She is a Catholic author, bioethicist, and homeschooling mother. She has the Choosing Human Substack newsletter, as well as the Brave New Us podcast. She routinely writes articles across a number of publications concerning topics that are close to home and on the frontier of science, of faith, and ethics. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to you and tell us a little bit about how you got into this work.
Yeah, first of all, just thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here talking with you. How did I get into it? Well, I always loved reading, number one. I was always obsessed with books and I loved writing also. Um, but I went into college not thinking I was going to do either one of those professionally. And I think I started out as a psychology major, and then through a process of my own faith journey, ended up adding theology to that, and then ended up adding a philosophy minor. So I don't know, it just kind of evolved into these varying interests. And then one of the very last classes I took in college, that was my favorite, was Intro to Bioethics. It was contemporary bioethics. And by taking that class, my eyes were just opened up to this whole new world. And I went back and I got my master's. Actually, my first love is theology and specifically like spirituality and prayer. So I got my first master's degree in that. And then I was going to become a spiritual director is what I thought wanted to do. I was also teaching at that time, teaching high school theology, but they cut the spiritual direction program during the time that I was there, and the person retired, and they just didn't replace the person who was in charge of that. So then it was kind of like, well, why do I want to take my classes in? Because that's not an option anymore. And so when God closes one door, he opens another one. And then I just started taking all the bioethics classes. They were cross-listed with theology, so I took as many as I could. And then after I graduated, I said, I don't want to stop. And I went back and I got my master's in bioethics. And but then it was like a year and a half before I really started writing. I guess there's a lot, reading and writing involved in getting your degree. So I had to take a breath. So I didn't end up really writing much of anything that wasn't for my degree until I started staying home with my kids. I quit my job and then had this kind of like a domestic monastery type experience where I had, quite a bit to do physically with two little ones at the time. With my hands, but my mind was really more free to roam during the day. And so then that's when I started writing and started off just blogging, and then ended up, writing about the things I know. So a lot about prayer, a lot about motherhood, and also about bioethics.
Amazing. I actually saw a post, it was on Substack. I think it was a while ago, but they were taking you through different authors or, great writers of their time and talking about how, like, they got their ideas for the things that they wrote, like
Mhm.
washing dishes or
Mhm.
folding laundry or, doing these kind of like mundane routine tasks. But there's something about doing that that kind of just opens up your mind. And so
Mhm.
is that kind of how it worked for you, where you found, like
Oh,
you said,
yeah.
your mind was roaming throughout the day?
Yeah, especially when I first started, because I'm a big journaler. I started every day journaling, and it was all this prayer, because motherhood is hard and challenging. So it was a lot of how do I do this? How do I handle this? And so that's what I started blogging about, was just taking whatever I was praying with and then kind of, I guess, formalizing it or verbalizing it in a way that might be helpful for other people too.
Yeah. So just looking at your background here, like you
Mhm.
said, you were interested in the psychology, and then it was theology, and rounding out with philosophy, and then bioethics. So when you were thinking about all of these things, right, and that led you into doing your writing, and so throughout the day,
Mhm.
I was noticing that a lot of the degrees that you were interested in, psychology, theology, philosophy, a lot of them tend to be very interiorly focused.
Mhm.
And so looking at a lot about like how we think, how we feel, why we feel.
Mhm.
Were those lenses that you were using as you were like getting into the writing, portion of your career here after after those classes?
Oh, yeah. I mean, definitely. Those are the lenses
Mhm.
that I approach everything with. Especially just thinking about one central question that probably always comes back to it is, what does it mean to be human? And
Mm.
what does it mean to be human in these various contexts? And how do we understand that through prayer? How do we understand that through our most central relationships? If
Uh-huh.
we start to then change the way that we um, reproduce and bear children, how does that change what it means to be human at a substantial fundamental level? So, yeah, for sure.
Mhm. Did you ever have, like, a moment where you were learning about some of these topics and it was, like, the light bulb moment where you're, like where you found that central question or that was first posed to
Mm.
you?
I don't know if there was one light bulb.
Mhm.
There's like a lot of um light bulb is probably too bright. Like a lot of little flickering candles, tea light candles or something. Um
Right.
But yeah, just it's interesting now though to go back and see the kind of the seeds of what I write about now that
Mhm.
were things that I was already starting to focus on in my graduate level work. So it was, they were assignments, but I had some freedom in how I responded to questions, or sometimes I had complete freedom to choose
Mhm.
depending on the professor. And so there's definitely things that I was working through then that I could see, oh, that's coming back again. I just my agent has a book proposal out on submission now, and a lot of what ended up in chapter 1 was from my master's thesis from theology. So I can see that the way that, like, in retrospect,
The through
oh, that
threads.
was really important to me. Or my I guess it was at my undergrad. One of my really important big papers, they kind of all bleed together now, was on artificial reproductive technology. And that was
Okay.
one that I think was a big spark for me in terms
Mhm.
of looking at bioethics, and then the things that I want to continue to look at in bioethics. That definitely bloomed and blossomed because in my first book, Reclaiming Motherhood from a Culture Gone Mad, the most substantial part, and where my heart was really alive. I mean, it was alive for the
Mhm.
whole thing, but in a special way for the few chapters on surrogacy, IVF, reproductive technologies. So that kind of it
Mhm.
just continues to grow and blossom and come back in different
Mhm.
ways.
Were you a mother at that time yet? Or was that
Yes.
before you had children? Okay.
Yes.
So, it was probably pretty influenced by that?
The the artificial reproductive technology, I don't remember. I had
Mm.
2 kids while I was going to graduate school for kind of a while because I was also teaching full time. So as
Mm.
mom teaching full time, going to night school, it was a very busy, crazy time. I don't actually wouldn't recommend it. um,
Right.
but it's what God had for us, and it has worked out in our lives. He's brought good out of it, whether it was the best
Yeah.
thing or not. So
Amazing. So, I'll take us back to, you had, become a mother, doing the homeschooling, staying at home, and you found that you had the time and your thoughts were naturally turning to these topics that you wanted to write about.
Mhm.
How did you get from there to starting to submit articles, to creating books? How did you launch this new branch?
Okay, well, so I wasn't homeschooling yet, and if I
Okay.
had already been, I probably wouldn't have tried to do something on top of it because it's pretty demanding.
Mm.
But the time that I started writing, I had a 2.5-year-old, or I guess a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old. Um, so I was just starting to blog. I didn't know what a blog was, so I was just putting things up on a website that I figured out how to do on the internet. And I had not been active on social media at all because I was, like I said, I was teaching full time, going to grad school. Like I didn't have time for blog. I barely had time to read just for fun, which
Mhm.
was a big sacrifice for me. So I was not doing like social media or anything. But I by Providence, met somebody who was a really successful blogger in the Catholic space. The Holy Spirit just kind of sat us down together at an event. And I said, "Oh, what do you do?" And she's like, "I have this blog at the time. I didn't know anything about it, but now I'd be
Mhm.
like, oh my gosh, I can't believe the Holy Spirit just sat me down next to you." And she was really kind and gave me a lot of her time
Mm.
and kind of talked me through it. She said, "Well, you should probably try to get on social media because if you're writing and you want to connect with people, that's a good idea." And that was a good idea for me at the time.
Mhm.
And I ended up finding out about this website that I was really excited to contribute for. And just started to look for places like, where can I use my gifts? And so I ended up being a contributor at this website. They had a team of contributors writing about women in the church, and it wasn't paid. It was all volunteer, but I learned so much. And then I
Mm.
ended up getting connected with the editor who eventually picked up my first book through that connection. So I know there's a lot of people are like, you should get paid for your writing. Don't give it away. And I wasn't in a place where I needed that. And so I kind of
Mhm.
saw what I was doing as an apostolate of like, I have these, I'm like drowning in babies. I can't go out and do these other, hands-on things, but I can write, before they wake up. I can write during
Mhm.
nap time, and this fits really well. So I kind of saw it as like a vocational service, a way to
Mhm.
get back to the church and to evangelize. And then it ended up, God blessed it and not in a with a paycheck, but in other ways. And then eventually did find some great websites that where I could do both. So kind of grew into that.
So, were you just starting off with writing like articles and essays, or did you jump right into some of your now like full length books that you have for offerings?
So I was just kind of at first blogging just
Mhm.
whatever came to me. So a lot of that was about motherhood in the church, but a lot of it also wasn't. And then I started to look at what the output was, and I recognized, oh, there's some themes here. Um and then I started to put it together and say, okay, I'm going to make
Mm.
these this thing into a book, which is still on the back burner and not done yet. It's the first thing I submitted. But I ended up developing a different proposal because when I submitted that to the editor, she said, your background is in motherhood and bioethics and theology. Is there a book there? Because what I was writing was mostly about motherhood and prayer.
Okay.
She's like, we don't need that right now this, at that publisher. They didn't need another prayer and mom
Mhm.
book. And so I'd love to still write that one day. I have a friend who's a Jesuit priest. It's on Ignatian spirituality and motherhood. And so I think someday that might,
Mhm.
blossom into something. But right now it's on the back burner.
On that
Mhm.
topic
Mhm.
of getting connected with an editor and you have this first submission and she says, well, really, that's not what we're looking for with the market right now.
Mhm.
Um, I think I told you previously that season one of the podcast Between the Edits, we had a lot of fiction authors, which I
Yeah.
love, right? But I was really excited to bring on a nonfiction author and kind of bring in some of that perspective. I think maybe a lot of fiction or people who are primarily interested in fiction would be surprised to hear maybe some of a similar experience of, oh, not with the market, you know?
Mhm.
So nonfiction publishers and all that kind of stuff, they still look for those. Was that a surprise for you at the time?
No, because I had my mentor who was the professor who I took as many classes of his as I could during undergrad and grad school. He has written many, many books. And so I kind of had a
Nice.
little bit of a sense of what I was getting into based on his experience. And the other thing too is it's not just, I don't know if this is true about fiction, but it wasn't just about the general market. It was about what each specific publisher is looking
Mhm.
for. So even if you can have a great book and it can be great writing, but if it just doesn't fit with what that publisher does, then that's not going to be a good fit anyway. So that's essentially like uh,
Right.
a good discernment. It's
Yes.
not a good fit, for this particular publisher or this imprint. So let's move on and find some place where this book can get the best chance that it can. Um,
Absolutely.
but I think another big difference, fiction versus nonfiction, is as far as I know, your fiction book kind of has to be written when you take
Mm.
it to the publisher. And that's very different from, not all the time, but a lot of the time that's very different from nonfiction, because with nonfiction you're selling an idea. So you're
Mhm.
selling the proposal, and they kind of, sometimes publishers, depends again on the publisher. Some like to have the finished product and just say yes or no. A lot of them really like to have a hand in shaping how the book turns out. So you could go
Interesting.
in and say, this is my marketing plan, this is the table of contents, here are some chapter samples. And then they might say, okay, well, we like this, but can you make this change or this shift?
Mhm.
Even on query, I've had an editor come back and say, I like your idea, like this is just a paragraph, I like the idea, but can you put it more in this direction?
Mhm.
And I have said yes to that and I've said no to that. So it just kind of depends. Because if it's not a project you want to write, then it's not going to
Right,
work out.
right, if it wasn't the original intention.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was episode 6 of season 1 with Sophie Riley. She talked a lot about for the fiction market what the traditional publishing process
Mhm.
looks like. And you're exactly correct. She was saying that you don't want to go with your first draft, your messiest
Mhm.
draft. You should have a completed product that has probably been read by a couple of people, if not already been through some editing if you can. You want to give your book the best chance of making an impression on the editor and have it ready to go. Because if you get that request for the full novel, they're not going to wait 6 more months for you to finish it, right? And so it sounds like it's very different here. It's more of like you come with a structured outline,
Mhm.
and then work with the editor a little bit about how that book is going to be finalized. I'm assuming there's a lot of time spent in there. I think fiction authors can probably relate to this as well, but in a different respect of the research aspect
Mhm.
of writing these books. Can you speak a little bit about? I'm sure that's a beast.
Yeah. It depends, right? Because if I am writing about, for example, one of the books that I have coming out this year is a prayerful and practical guide to growing food in the garden and raising little gardeners. So there's a lot of good tips for um, people who want to garden with their kids or homeschooling families want to make that a little bit more robust. There's a lot of research that went into that, but that was just research. I was living that life
Right.
for years. And so I didn't have to go out and do extra research because it was already in my mind. And the prayer reflections, I had been praying through those things for years before it even came out on the page. So that I might have had to look up the occasional like exact spacing for certain vegetables or something like that. But that was really light research, even though it required a lot of knowledge to get there, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Mhm.
Whereas for reclaiming motherhood, which it's very research heavy, I had done a lot of reading because I was interested, but then going back and formalizing and just keeping track of all of the articles that you've read
Right.
can be challenging. There's some good tools for that, but keeping track of the articles, keeping track of the books. I don't know how detailed you want me to go, but if I'm intentionally reading something, sometimes I'll listen to it on audio and then I'll go back and I also have the physical copy and then I'll go back and
Mm.
highlight or make notes in the book so that I keep that there because my memory is like really physical. So I remember where I see it on the page. So if I'm
Oh.
just listening on audio, I won't remember it as much. And then I have an app. I had an app called Drawer for a while, and then now I have one called what is it called? Instapaper. I really like Instapaper because I don't research on my phone anymore. My phone is like very dumbed down, so I can still use it for audiobooks, but I don't have any social media or email or the internet or anything on it. So Instapaper works really well for. I think it probably works great for mobile too. I just don't use it that way.
Yeah. So Instapaper, is that for taking notes or?
Oh, sorry. It's for keeping track of the articles that
Oh, okay.
you. So I hate having inbox clutter in my email, but I
Mm.
get a lot of emails of like things I want to read, but I don't necessarily want to read them while I want to get my emails cleared out. So I'll open it, I press send to Instapaper, and then everything that I've wanted to read is in Instapaper. I can tag it. So, like, all my embryo articles are tagged with embryo. All of my cloning articles are tagged with cloning, things like that. So it's just kind of a way to keep your stuff organized without having to print things out. I do really prefer to have hard copy and print things out, but it's not always going to work. And then sometimes you just want the article because you're like, I remember this is a scholarly source that I can prove this point I want to make. Yeah, it's free. It's great.
I love it. Yeah. And I can totally relate to you. I am also very physical person. I probably should get more used to listening to audiobooks. For the longest time, like I said, I just read a lot of fiction, and it isn't until the last year or two when I've like intentionally tried to read both fiction and nonfiction, and I've loved it. Right, completely changed my perspective on it. But for the longest time, I did not like audiobooks because I was reading fiction stories, and I was like, that's not how that character sounds. Um, but I imagine it's probably different with more of like a nonfiction style book, and that probably helps.
Yeah, although there have been a couple of times where I've just said, I'm not
Can't do
listening
it.
to this because I don't like this narrator. So
Yeah.
there's that
But
thing.
absolutely. Yeah, even in college, I was like, reading stuff and writing, and I would rewrite my notes. That was the thing. I was like constantly rewriting notes, and that was the thing that helped me remember stuff the best. Outside of teaching it to other people, which is another
Yeah.
great reason why I think writing articles and essays and books, like,
Mhm.
there's a lot of work that goes into it, and you spend so much time thinking over the information.
Yeah.
So it's no wonder that it kind of translates in that way.
Yeah.
We're going to take a quick break from the conversation so I can tell you a little bit about a great product. I want to tell you about the Tertulia for Authors website builder. As someone who made their own website when I first started freelance editing, I can tell you that it took hours of frustration to end up with a website that had half the functionality of the Tertulia for Authors website builder. This resource is specifically designed for authors, whether you're published or not. It's easily customizable, incredibly user-friendly, and puts vital marketing tools at the fingertips of authors, like blogs, event calendars, reader magnets, and email lists. And it's really affordable. So if you're an author looking to establish a website for the first time, or an author who already has a website but is looking to switch to a more manageable software, use the affiliate link in the description to sign up with Tortulia for Authors. Using this link does help support the podcast and is greatly appreciated. Now back to the podcast. So you've got books about spirituality, you've got books
Mhm.
about motherhood and prayer, you've got books now about gardening. You also cover topics like, bioethic topics, like you're talking about surrogacy, IVF, all these things.
Mhm.
So we're talking a wide range of things here.
Mhm.
But I can see how you were talking about in the beginning of the podcast, where the through thread is, what does it mean to be human?
Mhm.
And I also know that you mentioned, you're a Catholic author, and a lot of that comes to the forefront of your writing. How does your faith inform how you approach all these topics and that
Mhm.
through thread of what does it mean to be a human?
Yeah. Well, when I'm writing about prayer and spirituality, and how to be a mother, those things are all, they most of the time start in prayer and start in my journal as like physically written out in cursive. But for when we're talking about bioethics and everything, those questions are exciting to me because they are ways to explore the theological anthropology is like the fancy term for it, but essentially the our understanding of what it means to be human. And I think that the church, the Catholic Church, has beautiful theology on that, and I do believe it is the truth. And so the one thing that I think it's really easy to get caught up in like political back and forth on certain topics in bioethics, like
Mhm.
abortion, end of life issues, those whatever you believe about them, right? It's you're probably not lukewarm. There's very few people who are like that topic's just I don't have an opinion on that. There are people, but most of the time they can be quite polarizing. A
Mhm.
lot of the questions and the issues that I really like to look at are things where we don't have our minds made up yet about
Mhm.
them, and I think they make really great ways into the question of what it means to be human.
Mhm.
So when we look at genetic editing or I don't know, stem cell research where they're creating mini brains to test drugs and whether these things have consciousness or not, um, uh, uterine transplants, things that we have to stop and think like, wait, I don't know what I think about this,
Mhm.
or I do, but I need to be able I have an intuition, but I need to be able to articulate that intuition.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
then when people are searching to be able to answer those kinds of questions, then they're maybe a little bit more open to hearing from not just the Catholic Church, but just people who have been thinking about these questions. And that's
Right.
mostly religious traditions have been thinking about these questions of what it means to be human for thousands of years. So when we start looking at what does it mean to be human, and people are I think a good example of this right now is the topic of birth control,
Mm.
contraception, because for the longest time, the Catholic Church has been opposed, and people have been like, that's crazy. And people are starting to question that and say, oh, I don't know if I want to be pumping my body full of hormones. I don't know if this is a good idea. And so for secular people who fall, then they kind of start looking at, well, maybe there's something to this. And there's a whole contingent of Protestant women who are also re-examining their use of the pill.
Mhm.
And I think that's great. I think to be able to look at those things a little bit more deeply, more critically, and it's not a bad thing.
Yeah. So you would probably be an excellent person to kind of give your experience with the topic of the interplay of science and faith.
Mm,
And I've talked about this before. It's a topic that I'm very fond of because for the longest time, I was not a Christian until more recently here within the last 6 or 7 years. And so before then, I very much had the impression of that they could not coexist.
mm,
If you believed in science at all, you could not believe in faith or religion or anything like that. That religion was a crutch for people who didn't want to think critically about things. Um, Very wrong. Yeah, I found out very quickly I was very wrong. And it was because of a couple people in my life who were very intelligent. And I could not, in good conscience, claim that they were not smart people because they believed in Christ. And so that really opened the door to me. And then I found out that there's all this evidence out there that where science is downstream of God, science points to his creation and all this kind of stuff. But that is a general concept that I think a lot of people see of like this divide between, the secular and religious, obviously, but that science falls solely in the secular side.
mm,
Whereas have spent a lot of time studying a lot of these things and then employing them with this religious cornerstone. So, what are your thoughts on that as a general topic of all of these things where, you were talking about birth control and the artificial
mm,
intelligence and all this kind of stuff that a lot of people might put firmly in the secular camp, when
mhm.
in reality, you see all these things connecting?
Yeah, I mean, but because science and religion as disciplines answer different questions. They're not,
Mm,
they don't have the same goal. Science can explain how something works and why it works that way, but it can't explain why it is.
mhm,
Um, when we look at something like genetic editing, science can tell you how to edit the genes. It can tell you what genes are. It can tell you what will happen to an extent, right? We don't know everything right
mhm,
now, but if you make this little adjustment, you might know how that's going to go. That's great. Science can't tell you what it means to bear a, a genetically edited child.
mhm,
Um, those are and will always be questions that belong to religion and philosophy. So I don't think that they are as at odds as people think that
mhm,
they are. People might say, I don't want to think about those questions. Well, that's a different issue. Um, and I do think that there's a lot in science, and there are a lot of really brilliant people throughout history who also believe that science can point us, just the wonder at creation points
mhm,
us to wonder at the creator. Um, and I don't think that that is contradictory.
mhm,
And I also don't think that it is appropriate to push religion out of scientific questions about the kinds of scientific exploration that we
mm,
do, because what you have then is just like this tyranny of a secular orthodoxy, and it says, oh, only those beliefs that don't rely on God are allowed
mhm,
here, which is really problematic because we really only have a sense of human dignity because of the Judeo-Christian tradition and really Christianity, because the way that people were treated, the way that slaves were treated, the way infants were treated at the time before Christ was really atrocious. And I think we can see how secularism kind of brings us back to that a little bit. It's
mhm,
very hard to support the notion of human dignity and that we are all equal without uh, the Judeo Christian beliefs that we
mhm,
have given to us and passed down to our faith tradition. So, I mean, if you want to have a just world, if you want to pursue justice in science, I think that at the very least, you have to be willing to listen to people of faith,
mhm,
and it doesn't negate the validity of their belief if it comes from a religious inspiration or not. I think that that is really fallacious belief to say that just because you inherited this tradition that from, thousands of years of history, you have continuity then with a community of thousands of years of history of people who have thought similarly about how we ought to be treating each other and how we ought to live. And I think that we're really doing a big disservice to say, silence, we don't want to hear from that just because you have this relationship with God. I don't know. I think that would be that would be a mistake. I
Yeah.
don't feel like I need to not listen to people just because they don't believe in God.
Hmm.
I'm willing to listen to what they believe, and I think it matters and has value. So I think that's just like a basic
Hmm.
common courtesy, respect. And there are lots of people who are secular people who also are willing to listen to religious people. So
Yeah,
we just need to lean
absolutely.
on that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect segue into the next question I was going to ask you. Um, and this, if this is too personal of a question, just definitely let me know. No worries at all. But did you ever feel like your faith was challenged as you were going through and like doing your studies into some of these disciplines and getting your degrees in them? I'm not sure where you got your
Um,
degrees and like through what institutions, but I know that that's something that other people have struggled with of feeling like their faith was challenged as they're doing these types of disciplines.
do you mean like personally I've wrestled, or do you mean like my faith was challenged by uh professors or
I was initially thinking more of the former, but I think
okay.
both are probably valid experiences. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because I went to Loyola Marymount, Los Angeles, and it's a Catholic university. And I was not Catholic. I became Catholic while I
Oh,
was
okay.
attending, and was actually part of the reason that I added theology, and as my major was because of this faith experience that I had. So I always had faith growing up, but definitely was a big part of my journey in
Mhm.
undergrad, and then I actually both of my master's degrees are from Loyola Marymount. So I didn't move very far away, and then was teaching and driving, commuting at night. So the interesting thing about the experience as a student there is that the philosophy professors, I think, in the philosophy department are much more solidly Catholic than
Mhm.
the theology professors. And the theology professor, there's a lot of diversity. They're not all Catholic.
Mhm.
There are, some great Protestant scholars and of different various faiths. And I enjoyed my classes with them. But the culture of the university was definitely not really like vibrantly. I didn't become Catholic at that university because of the university.
Mhm.
It was because of the students that I encountered in the particular group. Let's just say that. So I definitely didn't feel like I had to hide my beliefs.
Mhm.
But there was a lot of scoffing at certain scholars who are maybe more doing actual theology, which is faith seeking understanding. And I would say the
Mhm.
emphasis from a lot of the professors in that department was more religious studies.
Okay.
I had a friend who was very faithful Catholic coming in, and then because of his experience in the theology department, he graduated and didn't believe in God anymore. So that,
Mhm.
I mean, when that's the experience, like that's a problem.
Right.
That's not
Mhm.
that's not faith seeking understanding. That's not theology. And so I think there's a lot that could be improved.
Mhm.
And I hope and pray that that changes. And maybe,
Mhm.
it's been a while since I've been there, so maybe it is different.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for letting me ask that. I wasn't sure if it
Yeah.
was going to be too personal, but I know that that can be an experience for some people of learning the science disciplines and feeling like, for whatever reason, it challenged them in regard to their faith. So, Um, but it's also very interesting to hear kind of you're talking about the other perspective of you can fall into the same pitfalls in the reverse direction of, if you try to take religion and faith and spirituality and put it in other places or boxes and things like that, sometimes you can go in the wrong direction with that too and end up leading people away from it.
Yeah.
Hmm. Um, one of the last questions I wanted to ask you before our final closing fun question. I've had a couple of communications majors come on and discuss with them about, what does communications look like when it's writing, and kind of bringing in some of those perspectives as well. And I imagine communications in the bioethics field is significant, how you communicate about the various topics of bioethics.
Hmm.
Um, was that something that was ever part of your classes? Is that something that you just learned and observed and had those experiences with it? I just imagine it's
Yeah.
probably a big consideration.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because a lot of people, when I say bioethics, they're like, "What is that?" And then you give them examples of how it actually it plays out and is part of their life. And they're like, "Oh, okay, I get that, I understand that." Um, Something that I'm really interested in, and one of the first projects I took on outside of writing was a storytelling podcast about genetic manipulation, and that was Brave New Us. And I quickly found, like, one, I loved that, and I loved using that storytelling format, and then two, it was there's a reason that there are people who get paid full-time salaries to make those things, and like there's
Yeah.
more than one person credited with making it. So the rest of the podcast did not stay a storytelling podcast, but it's still something I'd really like to get into. I have an idea for another season, or project that I would really like to explore that way. I think the format of audio storytelling podcasts is really interesting. I'm really kind of lit up
Mhm.
by those kinds of podcasts, and I don't know, still tugging at my heart. So maybe I'll do one of those.
Yeah.
But the reason that I think that's so great is because then it takes these abstract questions, and they're really human questions, so it kind of puts you in the human stakes,
Mm.
and helps
Personalizes
you
it.
can, yeah, and when you're talking about really complex things, you can get great sound bites from really smart people, and then you can put them into a narrative that is more accessible to the
Mm.
everyday person. So that's kind of something I'm passionate about, is taking the academic discourse that's kind of like all up here, all heady, and then bringing it to a more human level where it'd be like edutainment, for lack of a better word, This
Yeah.
is like, I'm learning a lot and I'm fascinated by this, and this is important.
I just recently interviewed, his name is Thomas Salerno. He has his debut novel is a narrative nonfiction book for children and teens. And it tells the life of I believe it was an archaeologist or a
We follow his
paleontologist.
subject. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, okay, you know what I'm talking about. So he was talking about this, about how, it was really formative for him because it showed him that, like, he can be reading and learning about things, but it feels fun. It's like, it's like what everybody wants out of fiction, but then
Mhm,
also put, like, real, like, facts and knowledge and stuff in it. Not in, like, a historical fiction kinda way, but in, like, this is somebody's life, like a biopic or something like that.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then using that same principle you're saying and making topics in bioethics that feel very either abstract or just like out of someone's grasp, very
Mhm.
academic, like you were talking about, and bringing it into a more like humanized, personalized story to show the impact of these big questions.
Well, yeah, because the discourse around bioethics tends to be a lot in academia or academia adjacent, but these are these are our lives that we're talking
Mm,
about. We're talking about life and death medical experiences. We're talking about technology that we're considering putting implants in our brains. That's not
mm,
something that affects just people in academia or just the scientists or the
right.
researchers at all. These are human questions and that's the other thing. You can't really like silo these conversations and say this
Mm,
isn't for me, or we don't
mm,
want input from this people, or how even when it comes to something like infertility, a lot of times people will say, well, you don't experience infertility, so you shouldn't have a say in this.
mhm,
And the reason that we have a say in questions, that we all have a say in questions like how do we reproduce, is because these things affect the entire human community. It doesn't
mhm,
just a lot of these questions. If you don't want to commit assisted suicide, fine, but let's leave it as an option for the people who do want it. Well,
mhm,
when that is an option, we already know this because it is an option in some places, it becomes coercive. It affects the least among us. People can't get care, insurance care, coverage if they want to choose to live. People
Hmm.
become burdens. The existence of that as a sanctioned, legitimate option then is in and of itself coercive. It says, yes, you should all of you dying people, you should all consider this. You should all think of your loved ones so they don't have to watch you suffer. And it
Hmm.
kind of sets to the side kind of the meaning of being human, which is to be with each other, to be with God, and to receive life as a gift, every part of life, even when there is suffering, even when it's hard.
Yeah, everyone has a seat at the table for those discussions because we all have one thing in common, and that is humanity.
Yeah, and I think that the notion of autonomy, or the idea that we are reducible to just our own free will to do whatever
Mm.
we want, is kind of, it's very pervasive in bioethics. It's part of the American ethos, I think, too, in a
Individualism.
particular way. Yeah. And it's false. Like, it's not true.
Hmm.
None of us are like coming into the world completely autonomous, and we all are dependent on each other. We're
Hmm.
dependent on each other as we come in, and we're usually dependent on each other as we go. And we're actually really dependent on each other for much
Throughout
of
the
the
whole thing.
middle, and it doesn't really do anybody any good to deny that.
Right. And we have obligations to others, right? Like that's the idea behind rights, in the civil sense and in the kind of the more abstract sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, last thing I'll ask you is the most difficult, yes, most fun question.
Yeah.
2, 3 book recommendations for our listeners.
Okay, well, I'm gonna have to go with books by C.S. Lewis.
Let's do it.
Not only because the book that I had that just came out is based on the Screwtape Letters, so I would say books by C.S. Lewis. Number one is going to be the Screwtape Letters, which is a series of letters from a senior demon to a younger demon, explaining how to tempt a newly converted Christian. It's brilliant. It's
Mm.
funny. It's creepy. And I would say the thing about Lewis, talking about reading fiction and nonfiction, so he wrote fiction and nonfiction.
Mm.
Um, his nonfiction is incredible, but his fiction makes his nonfiction more real. Like, it just
Hmm.
comes alive in your mind. So I would say Screwtape Letters for sure. Um, I wrote a version for moms, so there's my
And
little
what's it
plug
called?
for that book. It's called The Bellbind Letters.
There it is.
um, so there's that, and then I would also say his space trilogy for sure. You don't have to read all of them; they can be read independently. So his dystopian is That Hideous Strength, which is the last one, but I actually really love the second one the most. It's called Paralandra. His
Hmm.
depiction of evil, like I said, just makes it's it's so good. It's chilling. And,
Yeah. I actually, my fiance's in the middle of a book club right now where they're reading all 3 of those. And he was not a reader before this, and I think it may have sold him on it.
Letters to Malcolm, Chiefly on Prayer, is kind of, a lot of people don't know that he wrote this one, but it's kind of like the Screwtape Letters, but it's just letters from one friend to another on prayer. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of stuff in there that's really brilliant and not in any other books on prayer that I've read. So highly recommend. And then The Great Divorce. Well,
Perfect. Okay.
and if you have to, if you're not familiar, you want to start somewhere, maybe start with The Great Divorce because it's the shortest, and um it's so good. It really helps you see how you and your loved ones get stuck in these patterns of sin. And
I love it. Well, that is a great little cliff notes for C.S. Lewis of like where to start, what to do, what you should read. So
and
I
then
love it.
obviously Chronicles of Narnia
Right.
for
Just
that's
all the
and
C.S. Lewis books, really. I mean,
well, I think he said something. This is not a direct quote because I don't know the direct quote, but he said something about how, like, fairy tales for kids should be just as good when you read them as an adult. And I think they're even better when you
yeah,
when you
yeah.
read Chronicles of Narnia as an adult. So I've read it myself a couple of times, and then in college, and then with my each of my kids. It goes like that. It goes like that. Thank you. So this one has not read it yet, but she will.
Yeah, there we go. That'll be perfect. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much. I have really enjoyed our conversation.
Me
If
too.
people want to get connected with your work, like we were talking about a
Mhm.
little bit earlier, you said your website is the best way to do that.
Yeah, my website's got all the links to the Substack and the podcasts and the books and all that. So,
Perfect. Yeah, I'll make sure to put it in the notes here. But for people who are listening, that should be www.snstevenson.com.
yeah, Stevenson with a PH. It's
That's right. Yes.
fun
Thank
to
you.
spell.
Stevenson with a PH. Awesome. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I really
Well,
appreciate you
thank
being
you.
on today.